Part 1. The Weight of the World. The rain came down in icy sheets as Grace pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders. The bus shelter offered little protection from the storm, but it was better than standing in the open. She checked her watch, 11:47 p.m. Another 15 minutes until the last bus of the night. Her feet ached from 14 straight hours at the shelter, where she'd spent the day mediating arguments, helping fill out paperwork, and comforting a terrified teenager who'd just aged out of foster care. Grace's phone buzzed in her pocket. She already knew who it was before she looked. "Mom?" she answered, pressing the phone close to her ear to hear over the rain. "Grace, honey?" Her mother's voice was frayed at the edges, the way it always was when she had to ask for money. Again. Is there any way? Grace closed her eyes and leaned her forehead against the plexiglass wall of the shelter. The condensation from her breath fogged the surface. "I get paid Friday," she said. "I can send something then." A pause. Then the quiet, familiar sound of her mother trying not to cry. "Mr. Henderson came by today. He said if we don't pay by Monday, he's changing the locks." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Grace squeezed her eyes shut tighter. The apartment was a dump, peeling wallpaper, a stove that only worked half the time, windows that whistled when the wind blew, but it was home, or the closest thing they had to one. "I'll figure it out," Grace promised, her voice steadier than she felt. The bus arrived in a spray of dirty rainwater. Grace swiped her pass and took a seat in the back, away from the handful of other late-night riders. She pulled up her bank account on her phone, though she already knew the numbers by heart. $217.42. Payday was in 3 days, but after rent, utilities, her mother's medication, and the endless stream of emergencies that always seemed to crop up. Her phone buzzed again, a text from her brother, Jamie. "Sis, you okay? Mom's freaking out." Grace sighed and typed back, "Tell her not to worry. I've got it handled." The lie tasted bitter. By the time Grace got off at her stop, the rain had slowed to a cold drizzle. She trudged the 3 blocks to her building, her sneakers soaking through. The neighborhood wasn't great. She passed 2 boarded-up storefronts and a flickering streetlight, but it was what they could afford. She froze when she saw the door. Their things were piled on the sidewalk. A suitcase with a broken wheel, garbage bags stuffed with clothes, her little sister's backpack, the one with the unicorn patch Grace had sewn on last Christmas. All of it sitting in a puddle. Grace's hands started shaking. She ran up the stairs and banged on the super's door. "Mr. Henderson, please, just give me until Friday." The door swung open. Mr. Henderson stood there in a stained undershirt, his face unreadable. "Grace, I like you. I really do. But this is the 3rd time I've extended you. I got my own bills to pay." I know, but my mom's sick and my sister—" "I'm sorry." And he did look sorry, which somehow made it worse. Rules are rules. Grace stood there, rainwater dripping from her hair, and realized there was nothing left to say. She hauled their belongings to the relative dryness of the building's overhang. The suitcase was too heavy to carry far, especially with the broken wheel. She'd have to come back for the rest tomorrow, if it was still here. Grace pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts. She could call Jamie, but he was crashing on a friend's couch already. Her coworker Maria had 4 kids in a 2-bedroom. There was no one. She sank down onto the suitcase, the cold plastic seeping through her jeans. The reality of their situation settled over her like the rain, heavy, inescapable. Grace had spent her whole life taking care of others. At 12, she was making meals while her mom worked double shifts. At 18, she turned down a college scholarship because her family needed her income. Now, at 26, she was good at her job, damn good. But none of that mattered when she couldn't even keep a roof over their heads. A car slowed as it passed, the driver eyeing her curiously. Grace straightened her shoulders and wiped her face, though she wasn't sure if it was rain or tears. She had until morning to figure something out. The shelter where she worked had a strict no overnight policy for staff. The women's shelter across town was always full. Maybe she could. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. Grace almost didn't answer, but something made her press accept. Grace? A woman's voice, sharp and clear. This is Eleanor Whitmore. We need to talk. Part 2. An Unlikely Encounter. Grace stared at the phone pressed against her ear, rainwater dripping from her fingertips onto the cracked screen. The voice on the other end carried an aristocratic crispness that clashed violently with the squalor surrounding her, the overflowing dumpster 2 feet away, the distant wail of police sirens, the suitcase digging into her thighs where she sat atop it like some pathetic makeshift throne. Mrs. Whitmore? Grace's breath fogged in the cold air. She knew exactly who this was, the shelter's newest and most notorious resident. 78 years old, old money Boston pedigree, and according to the intake forms, worth approximately $14 million before her family had her declared incompetent and dumped her at their facility 3 weeks prior. How did you get this number? A dry chuckle crackled through the receiver. Child, when you've outlived 3 husbands, you learn how to get what you want. Now listen carefully. A garbage truck roared past, drowning out the next words. Grace cupped the phone tighter. I'm sorry, I didn't. I said I know where you live, Mrs. Whitmore enunciated slowly, as if speaking to someone exceptionally dim. Or rather, where you don't live anymore. Look up. Grace's head snapped up. Across the street, idling beneath a flickering street lamp, sat a black town car so polished the rain slid off its hood like mercury. The rear window rolled down just far enough to reveal a skeletal hand with manicured nails making a beckoning motion. Every survival instinct Grace had developed growing up in neighborhoods like this screamed at her to run. But the weight of the garbage bags pressing against her ankles, the memory of her mother's trembling voice, they left no room for pride. She crossed the street with her suitcase bumping awkwardly behind her. As she approached, the car door swung open with a whisper of well-oiled hinges. The interior smelled of leather and something floral, gardenias maybe. And there, swaddled in what looked like a genuine mink stole despite the unseasonably warm autumn, sat Eleanor Whitmore. Up close, the old woman was both more and less than Grace expected. The shelter gossip had painted her as some Cruella de Vil figure, but the woman watching Grace with hawk-like intensity had sunken cheeks mapped with broken capillaries and eyes the pale blue of faded denim. One gnarled hand clutched an oxygen tube beneath her nose. Well? Mrs. Whitmore snapped. Are you getting in, or do you intend to drown out there? Grace hesitated, rainwater pooling in the hollow of her collarbone. I don't understand what. Christ on a cracker, girl. Use what brains God gave you. The old woman's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. You need a place to sleep tonight. I require assistance with a rather delicate matter. This is what your generation calls a win-win scenario, is it not? A gust of wind sent rain sideways into the car. Grace's fingers tightened on the suitcase handle. She thought of her mother's blood pressure medication running out next week, of her sister's tuition payment overdue at the community college, of the way Mr. Henderson's door had closed with such finality. The leather seat was warm against her soaked jeans as she slid inside. The door hadn't even fully closed before the town car pulled away from the curb. Mrs. Whitmore produced a silver flask from somewhere in her furs and took a delicate sip. Your first lesson, dear. Never let them see you desperate. It gives them power. She extended the flask. Grace caught a whiff of what smelled like very expensive bourbon. I don't drink. You're shivering like a stray cat. The liquor burned all the way down, pooling warmth in Grace's empty stomach. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, suddenly self-conscious of her chipped nail polish. Where are we going? My apartment, of course. Mrs. Whitmore watched the city blur past the window. The one my idiot grandson doesn't know I still own. Grace's stomach lurched. Mrs. Whitmore, if this is about... Oh, spare me the moral panic. The old woman rolled her eyes. I'm not recruiting you for some sordid affair. I need your particular skill set. She reached into her purse and produced a manila envelope. These are the medical records my esteemed physicians claim prove I belong in that glorified dog kennel you work at. Grace flipped through the pages. The letterhead alone could have paid her rent for a year. Mass General Brigham and Women's, a private neurology clinic whose name she recognized from Boston Magazine's most expensive issue. You see the problem, Mrs. Whitmore stated more than asked. Grace did. Every test was borderline. Minor cognitive decline consistent with age, some short-term memory loss, but nothing justifying involuntary commitment. The sort of results any wealthy 78-year-old might have. Why me? Grace asked quietly. The car turned onto Commonwealth Avenue, where brownstones stood like sentinels of old money. Mrs. Whitmore's profile looked carved from marble in the passing streetlights. Because you're the only one in that place who looks people in the eye when you feed them, she said finally. And because I've watched you for 3 weeks, you don't steal, you don't lie unless it's to protect someone, and right now you're desperate enough to say yes. The town car slid to a stop before a pre-war building with a doorman in full livery. Grace's stomach twisted as she took in the ornate ironwork, the glowing lobby beyond. Places like this didn't let people like her through the service entrance, let alone the front door. Mrs. Whitmore followed her gaze. Relax, child. You're with me. The doorman's eyes widened as he rushed forward with an umbrella. Mrs. Whitmore, we hadn't expected... Clearly. She swept past him, Grace trailing in her wake like a bedraggled shadow. Have the concierge send up dinner for 2, and for God's sake find this girl some dry clothes. The elevator was paneled in mahogany, the kind that required an actual human operator. Grace watched the numbers climb, 10, 20, 30, her ears popping with the altitude. When the doors opened directly into the penthouse, her breath caught. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the city glittering below like a spilled jewelry box. The furniture looked like museum pieces, all clean lines and rich fabrics. A grand piano stood near the windows, its polished surface reflecting the storm clouds. Don't gawk, Mrs. Whitmore said, shrugging off her stole. It's just things. But to Grace, who'd spent her life counting every penny, it was like stepping onto another planet. She stood awkwardly on the marble foyer, her wet shoes leaving prints. A discreet cough made her turn. A uniformed maid stood holding a stack of towels and what looked like a silk robe. If you'd like to freshen up, miss. Grace looked down at her soaked shelter scrubs, suddenly hyper-aware of how she must smell. Sweat and cheap laundry detergent and the faint mildew from the bus shelter. She took the towels with murmured thanks. The guest bathroom was larger than her family's entire kitchen. Grace locked the door and leaned against it, her legs finally giving out. She slid to the floor, the plush rug soft beneath her. What the hell was she doing here? The mirror showed a stranger, dark circles under her eyes, hair plastered to her skull, the scar above her eyebrow from when Jamie had thrown a beer bottle during one of his rages. She looked exactly like what she was, a broke social worker who'd just been evicted. A knock at the door. Miss, Mrs. Whitmore requests your presence in the library when you're ready. Grace turned on the shower just to buy time. The water pressure was unbelievable, like standing under a waterfall. She scrubbed herself raw with soap that smelled like lavender and something indefinably expensive. The robe hanging on the back of the door was indeed silk, gliding over her skin like liquid. Grace had never worn anything so soft. She belted it tightly, suddenly aware of her bareness beneath. The maid had left clothes folded on a chair, cashmere sweatpants and a sweater that probably cost more than Grace's monthly paycheck. She dressed quickly, avoiding her reflection. The library was 2 doors down, its shelves stretching to the ceiling. Mrs. Whitmore sat in a wingback chair near the fireplace, a tumbler of amber liquid in hand. She'd changed into a tailored pantsuit that made her look like a retired diplomat. Sit. She gestured to the matching chair opposite her. We have business to discuss. Grace perched on the edge of the seat, her fingers digging into the buttery leather arms. Mrs. Whitmore, I appreciate the... Save your gratitude until you hear what I'm asking. The old woman set down her drink with a sharp click. I want you to help me prove my family committed elder fraud, and in return I'll ensure you never have to worry about money again. The fire crackled between them. Somewhere in the penthouse, a clock ticked. Grace's mouth had gone dry. That's a serious accusation, she managed. Mrs. Whitmore's smile showed teeth. Indeed, which is why I need someone with your particular talents, someone who knows the system, who can navigate bureaucracy without drawing attention. She leaned forward, and someone my family would never suspect. A waiter entered with a silver cart laden with food, steak, truffle mashed potatoes, asparagus so green it looked photoshopped. Grace's stomach growled traitorously. Eat, Mrs. Whitmore commanded. Then we'll talk details. Grace picked up her fork, her mind racing. This was insane, dangerous even. But as she took the first bite of steak, perfectly medium rare, melting on her tongue, she realized with dawning horror that she was already considering it. Part 3. The Old Woman's Request. Grace woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar silk curtains, her body sinking into a mattress so plush it felt like floating. For one disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the previous night came rushing back. The eviction, the town car, Mrs. Whitmore's impossible proposition. She bolted upright, the duvet pooling around her waist. The guest bedroom looked like something from a magazine, cream-colored walls, original artwork that probably cost more than her college tuition, a vanity with an actual silver hairbrush set. Her shelter scrubs had been cleaned and pressed, folded neatly on an upholstered bench at the foot of the bed. A discreet knock at the door. Miss Grace? Mrs. Whitmore is waiting in the solarium. The maid's voice was muffled through the heavy wood. Shall I draw your bath first? Grace's fingers clutched the sheets. No, thank you. I'll be right out. She dressed quickly, the fabric of her scrubs still warm from whatever fancy dryer they'd used. The penthouse was silent except for the faint hum of a vacuum somewhere deep in its recesses. Grace followed the smell of coffee down a hallway lined with black and white photographs, Mrs. Whitmore shaking hands with presidents, cutting ribbons at hospital wings, standing aboard yachts with various silver-haired men. The solarium was a glass-enclosed terrace overflowing with orchids and citrus trees. Mrs. Whitmore sat at a wrought-iron table, reading the Wall Street Journal through tortoise-shell reading glasses. She looked up as Grace hesitated in the doorway. You're late. Grace checked her watch. 7:15 a.m. I didn't realize we'd set a... Sit! The quiche Lorraine is getting cold. The table held enough food for 6 people, flaky pastries, a fruit salad with exotic berries Grace couldn't name, a carafe of orange juice so fresh it still had pulp floating in it. Her stomach growled audibly. Mrs. Whitmore pushed a plate toward her. Eat, then we'll talk business. Grace took a cautious bite of quiche. The flavors exploded on her tongue. Smoky bacon, creamy custard, cheese that actually tasted like something. She had to fight not to moan. You look like you've never had a decent meal in your life, Mrs. Whitmore observed dryly. Grace swallowed. Not like this. The old woman studied her over the rim of her coffee cup. Tell me about your family. The abrupt shift threw Grace off balance. She set down her fork. Why? Because if we're going to work together, I need to know what I'm dealing with. Mrs. Whitmore removed her glasses, revealing eyes as sharp as broken glass. Your mother is chronically ill. Your father is deceased. Car accident, if I had to guess from the way you flinch at sirens. One brother with substance abuse issues, one sister still in school. Am I warm? Grace's fingers tightened around her napkin. How did you... Please, I had you investigated the moment you walked me through intake paperwork at that glorified poorhouse. Mrs. Whitmore dabbed her lips with a linen napkin. The question is, what are you willing to do to get them out of that rat trap you call an apartment? A chill ran down Grace's spine despite the sunlight streaming through the glass. What exactly are you asking me to do? Mrs. Whitmore. The old woman reached into the pocket of her robe and produced a key card with the logo of a prominent Boston law firm. Today at noon, you're going to walk into Hollis and Crichton as a temp receptionist. You'll have exactly 27 minutes while the partners are at lunch to access file number WH4289 from the probate archives. Grace's pulse pounded in her ears. You want me to steal legal documents? I want you to retrieve what's rightfully mine. Mrs. Whitmore's voice turned razor sharp. My grandson and his viper of a wife had me declared incompetent based on falsified medical records. They've frozen my assets, sold my home on Beacon Hill, and dumped me in that shelter while they bleed my trust fund dry. She produced an iPhone from another pocket and played a video, a much younger man with Mrs. Whitmore's cheekbones speaking to reporters outside a courthouse. We're just grateful the judge recognized what's best for Nana, he said with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Grace pushed the phone away. Why not just hire a lawyer or a private investigator? Because every lawyer on retainer has been paid off, and every PI I've contacted has mysteriously dropped the case. Mrs. Whitmore leaned forward, her perfume, something floral and expensive, filling the space between them. They'll never suspect you. You're invisible to people like my family. The words stung more than Grace wanted to admit. She stared at her half-eaten quiche, appetite gone. And if I get caught? Mrs. Whitmore shrugged. You'll be fired, possibly arrested, but considering your current housing situation. She let the implication hang. Grace stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the tile. I need air. The solarium opened onto a private terrace overlooking the back bay. Grace gripped the railing, the morning breeze cooling her flushed face. Below her, the city sparkled, tourists boarding duck boats, finance bros power walking to early meetings, the homeless men who slept near the common already being rousted by police. She'd spent her entire life playing by the rules, work hard, be honest, help others. And where had it gotten her? Sitting on a suitcase in the rain while people like Mrs. Whitmore's grandson played Monopoly with real lives. A hand touched her shoulder. Grace turned to find Mrs. Whitmore holding out a mimosa and a crystal flute. 24 hours, the old woman said quietly. Give me 1 day of your moral flexibility. If you walk away tomorrow, I'll still pay your rent for a year, but if you stay... She gestured to the penthouse, the skyline, the whole glittering kingdom spread out before them. Imagine what you could do with real resources. Grace took the glass but didn't drink. The orange juice looked like liquid gold in the sunlight. Tell me about your grandson, she said finally. Mrs. Whitmore's expression darkened. Carter was the apple of my eye until he married that social climbing harpy. She convinced him I was losing my faculties right around the time I cut off their allowance. Her knuckles whitened around her cane. Last month, I overheard 2 orderlies discussing how much they'd been paid to keep me sedated. Grace studied the older woman's face, the intelligence burning in her eyes, the tremor in her hands that could be age or rage or both. Either Mrs. Whitmore was telling the truth, or she was the most convincing paranoid delusion Grace had ever encountered. And if I do this, Grace said slowly, what exactly is in it for me? Mrs. Whitmore smiled, a predator's smile, all teeth and no warmth. How does $50,000 sound as a starter fee? The number hit Grace like a punch. It would cover her mother's medical bills, Jamie's rehab, a real apartment in a safe neighborhood. She downed the mimosa in one gulp, the champagne bubbles burning her throat. Where do I start? Mrs. Whitmore's cane tapped a triumphant rhythm as she led Grace back inside. First, we change your appearance, the hair especially. That mousy brown won't do. Grace touched her ponytail self-consciously as Mrs. Whitmore picked up a house phone. Charles, bring the car around. We're going shopping. 2 hours later, Grace stared at her reflection in a Bergdorf Goodman dressing room mirror, barely recognizing herself. A stylist had chopped her hair into a sleek bob, dyed it a rich auburn that brought out the gold in her hazel eyes. The navy shift dress and blazer made her look like a junior associate at any given law firm. Not bad, Mrs. Whitmore mused from her perch on a velvet settee. She handed Grace a slim folder. Your new identity? Grace Whitmore, my distant niece from Albany. NYU grad, pre-law, temping while she applies to grad programs. Grace flipped through the forged documents, transcripts, a driver's license with her new hair color, even a Starbucks rewards card under the alias. You had all this ready? I pay people to anticipate my needs. Mrs. Whitmore rose with a wince, leaning heavily on her cane. Now come, we have one more stop before your interview. The town car dropped them at a nondescript office building near South Station. The elevator required a key card to access the 14th floor, where a blandly handsome man in his 50s greeted them. Mrs. W., he said with the casual ease of someone who'd known her for decades. The usual? Not today, Martin. Mrs. Whitmore nudged Grace forward. My protege needs the full treatment. Martin's eyes lit up. Ah, going corporate? Something like that. What followed was the most intense 90 minutes of Grace's life. Martin, a former CIA operative, according to Mrs. Whitmore, drilled her on everything from proper posture for hiding nerves to how to plant a thumb drive without looking suspicious. Remember, he said as he demonstrated how to fake a coughing fit to cover a file search, most security isn't watching for spies. They're watching for people who don't belong, so belong. By 11:45 a.m., Grace stood outside Hollis and Crichton's gleaming downtown offices, her palms sweating. The new leather briefcase, another gift from Mrs. Whitmore, contained nothing but a notepad, 3 pens, and a USB drive disguised as a tube of lipstick. You'll do fine, Mrs. Whitmore said from the town car. She handed Grace an earpiece. I'll be in your ear the whole time. Grace adjusted the device, her heart hammering. And if something goes wrong? The old woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. Then I never met you. The law firm's lobby smelled like money and anxiety. Grace smoothed her skirt and approached the front desk. Grace Whitmore, she said, channeling every privileged NYU grad she'd ever met at the shelter. I'm the temp for Ms. Alvarez. The receptionist barely looked up from her computer. Badges on the counter, HR says you're just covering lunch today. Elevator to the 22nd floor. Grace clipped the badge to her blazer, the laminated photo of her new identity staring back at her. As the elevator ascended, Mrs. Whitmore's voice crackled in her ear. Remember, file WH4289, probate archives are past the copy room. You've got 27 minutes starting now. The doors slid open on a sea of cubicles. Grace stepped into the lion's den. Part 4. The Final Gift. Grace's heels clicked against the marble floors of Hollis and Crichton with a confidence she didn't feel. The office buzzed with midday energy, junior associates rushing between cubicles, paralegals hunched over document reviews, the occasional partner sweeping through in a tailored suit that cost more than Grace's car. Turn left at the water cooler. Mrs. Whitmore's voice crackled in her earpiece. Probate archives should be... A sudden burst of static cut her off. Grace fought the urge to tap the device like a malfunctioning spy gadget. Instead, she grabbed a random folder from an empty desk and adopted what she hoped passed for a harried legal assistant expression. The probate archives were tucked behind a door marked Restricted Access, Authorized Personnel Only. Grace's pulse pounded in her throat as she swiped the keycard Mrs. Whitmore had provided. The light blinked red. She tried again. Still red. A voice from behind made her jump. Need help with that? Grace turned to find a young man holding a stack of files, his tie slightly askew. Up close, he couldn't have been more than 25, with the exhausted but eager look of a first-year associate. New temp system glitched, Grace said with an eye roll she'd perfected watching privileged NYU interns at the shelter. Card won't register. The guy, Ethan R.R., according to his badge, smiled in sympathetic frustration. Tell me about it. Took 3 weeks to get my cafeteria privileges working. He swiped his own badge and the door clicked open. What case you pulling? Grace clutched her fake folder tighter. WH4289, Whitmore Estate. Ethan's eyebrows shot up. Oh, damn, that's the crazy grandma case. He lowered his voice conspiratorially. Rumor is she tried to stab a nurse with a salad fork last month. Grace's nails bit into her palms. Sounds complicated. You have no idea. Half the partners won't touch it. Too much family drama. Ethan led her down rows of shelved case boxes. Here you go. WH files are on this aisle. The Whitmore box was thicker than Grace expected, bound with reinforced straps. Ethan hovered as she pulled it down. You need help carrying... Grace. Mrs. Whitmore's voice suddenly hissed in her ear. Get rid of him. Grace faked a sneeze directly into the crook of her elbow. Oh, God, I'm so sorry. Allergies. Probably shouldn't breathe on you. Ethan took a polite step back. No worries. I'll, let you work. The moment he turned the corner, Grace ripped open the box. Inside were hundreds of pages, medical reports, court filings, even handwritten notes from what looked like psychiatric evaluations. She flipped through frantically, her eyes catching phrases like exhibits paranoid tendencies and substantial cognitive decline. A folded sheet slipped from between the pages. Grace unfolded it to find a photocopy of a prescription pad, Dr. Evan Singh, Geriatric Psychiatry, with a Haldol 5 milligrams PRN for agitation, scrawled across it in nearly illegible handwriting, except the signature at the bottom didn't match the crisp E. Singh on the letterhead. That's it, Mrs. Whitmore whispered in her ear. Grace could hear the triumph vibrating through the static. That's the forgery. Photograph everything. Grace pulled out the lipstick USB and started snapping pictures, her hands shaking so badly she had to retake several shots. The clock on her phone showed she had 14 minutes left when a new sound cut through the archive's hum, footsteps approaching. She shoved the documents back just as a woman in a power suit rounded the corner. Can I help you? The woman's gaze dropped to Grace's badge, then to the open Whitmore file. Her expression hardened. Who authorized you to access this? Grace's mouth went dry. Ms. Alvarez sent me to... There is no Ms. Alvarez in this firm. The woman held out her hand. Badge, now. Grace, abort. Mrs. Whitmore ordered in her ear. Second floor women's bathroom, fire escape access behind the... Grace bolted. She dodged around a cart of case files, vaulted over a low partition, and hit the stairwell at a dead run. Behind her, shouts echoed as the woman called security. 3 flights down, Grace burst into a hallway just as an elevator dinged open. She slipped inside seconds before 2 guards rushed past. The second-floor bathroom was empty. Grace locked herself in a stall, ripped off the earpiece, and fumbled for her phone. What the hell was that? Mrs. Whitmore demanded when she answered. Grace struggled to steady her breathing. They knew I was fake. Someone's coming. Listen carefully. There's a service elevator past the copy room. Takes you straight to the loading dock. My car will be... The bathroom door banged open. Security, come out with your hands visible. Grace dropped the phone into the toilet and flushed. As the water swirled, she kicked off her heels, yanked the fire alarm, and burst from the stall in a wave of panic. The guard, a heavyset man with pepper spray already drawn, staggered back as the alarm blared. Grace ducked under his arm and ran for the emergency exit. The fire escape deposited her in an alley reeking of dumpsters and diesel fuel. Grace sprinted for the street, barefoot, her hair coming loose from its professional bob. A black town car screeched to the curb. Get in! Mrs. Whitmore threw open the door. Grace dove inside just as security rounded the corner. The car peeled away, merging into downtown traffic like nothing had happened. For several blocks, neither spoke. Grace's entire body trembled with adrenaline, her feet bleeding from broken glass in the alley. Mrs. Whitmore wordlessly handed her a handkerchief. Did you get it? The old woman asked finally. Grace reached into her bra and pulled out the folded prescription forgery. Enough to sink them. Mrs. Whitmore's smile could have cut glass. Good girl. The next 72 hours passed in a blur. Mrs. Whitmore's lawyers, real lawyers this time, not the ones on her grandson's payroll, moved with surgical precision. The forged prescription triggered a chain reaction, a medical board investigation into Dr. Singh, a probate court review, and finally a devastating Boston Globe expose titled Golden Handcuffs: How Boston's Elite Exploit Elder Care Laws. Grace watched it all unfold from the penthouse, where Mrs. Whitmore held court like a general after a victorious campaign. Reporters called hourly. Old society friends suddenly remembered how close they'd always been. And through it all, the old woman's gaze kept returning to Grace with something resembling pride. On the fourth morning, Grace woke to find a note slipped under her door. "Meet me in the library at noon. Wear the blue dress." The blue dress turned out to be a Diane von Furstenberg wrap dress still in its Bergdorf bag. Grace put it on carefully, the silk whispering against her skin like money. Mrs. Whitmore stood at the library window, silhouetted against the skyline. Without turning, she said, "My grandson signed the settlement this morning." Grace exhaled. "So it's over." "Oh no, my dear." Mrs. Whitmore turned, her eyes glittering. "It's just beginning." She pressed a button on the desk. The library doors opened and a procession of staff entered carrying silver trays. One held a single envelope. Mrs. Whitmore took it and extended it to Grace. "Your compensation, as promised." Grace opened it to find a cashier's check for $50,000. Her hands shook. "This is too much." "Nonsense, a deal is a deal." Mrs. Whitmore gestured to the other trays. One held keys and other legal documents, a third what looked like a jewelry box. "The rest is, discretionary." Grace stared. "I don't understand." The old woman sighed. "Must I spell it out? The apartment is yours. The trust fund covers tuition for that sister of yours. The jewelry was my mother's. Hardly my style, but it should suit you." Grace's knees buckled. She caught herself on the edge of a chair. "Why?" Mrs. Whitmore studied her for a long moment. "Because you didn't hesitate. Because when the moment came, you chose justice over rules." She stepped closer, her cane tapping like a metronome. "And because I've been watching you at that shelter, you have a gift, Grace, a rare ability to see people, really see them." Grace's throat tightened. "So what now?" "Now?" Mrs. Whitmore smiled. "Now we change the game." She handed Grace a business card embossed with a new name, Whitmore and Associates, Elder Advocacy Group. "Your office is downstairs," the old woman said. "I expect you Monday at 9. Grace stared at the card, then at the woman who'd upended her life in less than a week. The check in her hand represented more money than she'd ever held. The keys promised safety for her family. The job offered something she'd stopped daring to dream about, a future. Outside, the city glittered, indifferent to the small human drama unfolding high above its streets. Somewhere down there, her old life waited. The eviction notices, the rationed meals, the constant gnawing fear. Grace pocketed the check and squared her shoulders. "Monday at 9, she agreed. Mrs. Whitmore's cane tapped an approving rhythm as she led Grace toward the waiting lunch. Somewhere in the penthouse, a clock struck noon. The game had indeed changed. Part 5. A New Beginning. The first Monday morning of Grace's new life dawned with unnatural brightness, the sun glinting off the Charles River like scattered diamonds. She stood before the full-length mirror in her new apartment, her apartment, a concept still foreign after 26 years of borrowed spaces and temporary housing, adjusting the collar of her blouse for the 12th time. The woman staring back bore little resemblance to the bedraggled social worker who'd been evicted 2 weeks prior. The auburn bob had been professionally trimmed, the navy suit was tailored to her frame, and the watch on her wrist, a vintage Cartier Mrs. Whitmore had pressed into her hand yesterday, probably cost more than her old car. Grace touched the reflection, half expecting it to shatter like a mirage. Her phone buzzed, a text from her sister. "Mom freaked out when the movers came. She thinks you're drug running." Grace smiled and typed back, Tell her it's legal consulting. Same difference. The elevator ride down to the Whitmore and Associates office took 17 seconds. Grace counted each one, her stomach twisting. The doors opened directly into a reception area where a young man with a familiar face looked up from his computer. Ethan? Grace blinked at the erstwhile Hollis and Crichton associate now sitting behind her agency's desk. He grinned. Small world, huh? When Mrs. W. offered triple my law firm salary to be your paralegal, I may have screamed a little. Grace opened her mouth, closed it, then shook her head. Of course she did. The office was all clean lines and warm woods, more boutique firm than nonprofit. Glass walls displayed a bullpen of researchers already at work, while the far end held a closed door with Grace Whitmore, director, etched in understated gold lettering, her palms dampened. Don't hyperventilate, Ethan Stage whispered. Your 10 o'clock's already here. Some nursing home case that... The waiting room door burst open before he could finish. Where is she? The voice was shrill, Midwestern, and furious. A woman in her 50s charged in, dragging a bewildered elderly man by the hand. You're the ones who helped that Whitmore lady, right? Well, I got a situation. Grace instinctively stepped forward, her social worker reflexes overriding the imposter syndrome. I'm Grace. How can we... My daddy's facility is stealing from him. The woman shoved a stack of papers at Grace, bank statements, medication logs, a photo of the old man grinning in better days, his arm around a girl in a softball uniform. They took his wedding ring for safekeeping and now claim it was never there. And look at these charges. $200 a month for incidentals when all he gets is extra pudding. Grace felt it then, the old familiar fire in her chest. She took the files without glancing at Ethan's raised eyebrows. Mr. Oscar, the old man said softly. His eyes were milky with cataracts, but his grip was firm when Grace shook his hand. Oscar Dunn. I was a machinist for 40 years. Grace led them to her office, where sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows. As Oscar's daughter ranted about exploitation clauses and shady administrators, Grace noticed what wasn't being said. The way Oscar flinched at raised voices, the pressure sores visible at his wrists, the stale urine smell barely masked by cheap cologne. She'd seen it 100 times at the shelter, just with better upholstery. So I told that director, I said, my daddy fought in Korea, the daughter was saying. You can't just... Ms. Dunn. Grace's voice cut through the tirade. We'll get the ring back, but more importantly... She turned to Oscar. Sir, would you like to live somewhere else? The daughter gasped. Well, I never... Oscar's chin trembled. They took my radio. Grace pushed a box of tissues across the desk just as her office door opened. Mrs. Whitmore stood framed in the doorway, resplendent in Chanel tweed, her cane tapping a deliberate rhythm. Am I interrupting? Oscar's daughter paled. Oh, my lord, you're the lady from TV. Mrs. Whitmore inclined her head. And you, my dear, are about to learn what happens when someone steals from war veterans. She snapped her fingers. Ethan, draft a letter to the Massachusetts Attorney General. Grace, get our new client some coffee. We have work to do. By noon, Grace had 1. Confirmed Oscar's facility had 7 violations in the past year, all quietly settled. 2. Discovered the missing ring pawned by an aide in Revere 3. Scheduled Oscar for transfer to an assisted living home. Mrs. Whitmore's foundation quietly funded. By 3 p.m., she'd also fielded calls from 2 more families, a reporter from the Globe, and an irate nursing home administrator threatening to sue for defamation. Tell him to bring it on, Mrs. Whitmore cackled from her perch on Grace's sofa, where she was happily shredding the man's reputation between sips of Earl Grey. I haven't had this much fun since the 2008 divorce. Grace massaged her temples. We can't take on every case. Why not? Mrs. Whitmore set down her cup with a clink. You have the instincts, I have the resources, and Boston's nursing homes are crawling with villains who've gotten fat exploiting the helpless. She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. This is what justice looks like, Grace. Real, tangible change. Grace glanced at Oscar Dunn napping in a sunbeam, his reclaimed wedding ring gleaming on his finger, at his daughter crying grateful tears into Ethan's shoulder, at the stack of new client folders already growing on her desk. Outside, the city hummed along, oblivious to the tiny revolution brewing in one corner office. Grace's phone buzzed again. Her mother this time. Dinner. Sunday. Jamie wants to see your fancy new place. Grace typed back, yes, before turning to Mrs. Whitmore. What's next? The old woman smiled like a shark scenting blood. Darling, we've only just begun. Somewhere in the building, a clock struck 5. Somewhere beyond the glass, the setting sun set the river ablaze. And Grace Whitmore, once invisible, now undeniable, rolled up her sleeves and reached for the next file.